Hi, all. Thanks for joining us today. We have an exciting couple talks. I'm just going to give a brief introduction to our two speakers and to the modelers community of practice. So IARPC is the Interagency Arctic Research Policy Committee. It brings together leaders from many agencies, departments, and offices across the U.S. federal government to enhance collaboration across the Arctic. Welcome to this session of IARPC's Modelers Community of Practice. For anyone who's not familiar with IARPC, it brings together 18 agencies, departments, and offices to collaborate. Today's session is being hosted by the Modelers Community of Practice and aims to enhance the understanding of the integrated Arctic system through the use of regional and global Earth system models, primarily through the organization of monthly webinars, one of which is this one today. And it is co-led by myself, Renu Joseph, Hannah Mevenkamp, and Wilbert Wire. Wilbert is online today. And here's an introduction to today's session. As climatic conditions in the Arctic continue to change, so do the types of disturbances shaping these ecosystems. Some disturbances, such as fire, were present under pre-industrial conditions and are now undergoing significant regime changes. Others, however, are now emerging in regions where they were previously absent. Modeling the geographic expansion of such disturbances is critical to our understanding of the future of the high latitudes. In this session, we have two scientists who will present their work on modeling the expansion of beaver and spruce bark beetle range and habitat in Alaska. First, we will hear from Nancy Fresco from the University of Alaska-Fairbanks. She will talk to us about her work on modeling the current and future loss of climate protection from spruce bark beetle outbreaks in Alaska. And then next we'll hear from Ken Tape, also at UAF. He studies beaver expansion in the Arctic and will talk to us today about his work on habitat modeling and projected expansion in Alaska. So with that, I will turn it over to Nancy. If you have any questions, she can let you know if she would take them during the talk or at the end of her talk.
Thank you so much for the introduction. I guess the answer to during or at the end. If I say something that's utterly confusing or that needs correction, please do interrupt me. But there will also be room for questions at the end of the talk, hopefully. So I guess the answer there is both. And let me share my screen. Let's see. Sorry, can't do the full screen thing and the share at the same time. So there we go. Okay. All right. And I'll try to keep my talk to time so that there is plenty of room for questions and so that I don't cut into Ken's talk about beaver populations. So yes, very quickly, I'm here at the International Arctic Research Center at the University of Alaska-Fairbanks. I'm on Lower Tanana lands on the Trotiada campus. And I'm lucky to work with a very wide range of partners. So I will start by recognizing that the work I'm presenting was a hugely collaborative effort with teammates within our research group, but also very importantly, funding from the Alaska Climate Adaptation Science Center, and a shout out to Jeremy Littell, who is one of the leads on this project from the AK-CASC, and also some partners from the Forest Service. I was not at the start of this project an expert on spruce bark beetles. I had a lot of learning to do along the way, as in all collaborative projects. And so this is the project background. For those who aren't familiar, I think probably most people here are familiar with the Alaska Climate Adaptation Science Center, but very grateful for their support on this project. And for those who are not familiar with SNAP, a very fast introduction. We've been around long enough now that I think the word is out. Scenarios Network for Alaska and Arctic Planning. I was on board with SNAP from the very start. The Arctic focus was only a few months after the instigation that we realized that an Alaska focus was not nearly enough. But our goal is always to be as broadly collaborative as possible and to share results as broadly as possible. So if you haven't ever had a chance to explore our website, I invite you to do so and to explore some of the tools that we have there aimed at a wide range of different users, everything from very specialized engineering tools to very broad public access, trying to get data connected to real world problems and issues. So the issue that we were addressing for this particular piece of research was looking at spruce beetle risk in relation to long-term climate change. And this was chosen as one of the most pressing issues, something that people were talking about, something people are seeing, continuing to see on the land, and that clearly climate linked, but had not been comprehensively modeled, was understood to be climate linked, but with nothing that was prescriptively modeled based on beetle survival and reproduction. So we set out to gather the data, do the lit review, do the math, and try to create a model. So the effort here was one of looking at what has happened historically in Alaska, which is extremely well documented in terms of historical bark beetle outbreaks. Some of us might be old enough to remember the incredibly destructive outbreak on the Kenai Peninsula in the 1980s and 1990s. But then the recent surge on this graph is what's being seen today, more in the Matanuska-Susitna Valley, moving north across the state. And this is documented, and we set out to link it to the historical weather conditions taking place at that time and build our model from there. In order to do that, we were highly reliant on the fact that some incredibly patient and talented scientists going back to the 80s had closely documented and built their own smaller models linking climate variables or weather variables, temperature variables, to the life cycle behavior and survival of beetles. And so these are there's a a large works cited section, but these were the four sources that I relied on the most heavily in building the model, because we needed to understand what allows beetles to mature in a single summer, what allows beetles to survive cold winters, and how those are, what the mathematical relationships are there. So these were tremendously useful resources. And a lot of this effort was really trying to pull this together into one comprehensive model that took into account the full, not just annual, but multi-annual cycle of bark beetles. So very briefly, in order to create an outbreak, in order for a beetle to be successful, it needs to obviously survive and reproduce, and that is dependent upon being able to survive to reproduce within one summer cycle, to survive a winter with significant predation, to survive the rapidity of the cooling cycle in the fall, and to survive the most extreme cold temperatures in the winter. So this is just a quick overview. And for those who are less familiar with bark beetles and with their range across the far north, they exist at they are endemic. They exist at low levels across all forested spruce areas of Alaska. But outbreaks are what we're concerned about. And outbreaks are where the beetles move from being existing at low levels in very susceptible, dead, down, dying trees to attacking live trees and killing those trees. So we're looking at when the conditions are right for that to happen. And I'm going through this quickly. But again, life cycle, adult beetles fly in the spring, lay 20 to 30 eggs that will hatch that summer. And this is where you get the crucial summer accumulated heat index. If there are enough warm days to trigger that index within a set period of time, then you'll have mature beetles by the end of the summer. If not, they'll have to overwinter as larvae. If they have to overwinter as larvae, predation primarily by woodpeckers tends to be very high. The larvae are soft and tasty, the adult beetles not so much. So woodpeckers subsist almost entirely, in some cases, on these larvae in the winter, knocking the population way down. So even though this was not a predation model, it was a climate model, we had to include a predation piece of the model in order to mathematically model it. And then we had to think about habitat. So obviously not all of Alaska is habitat for beetles, but we did have to include all areas with white spruce, Sitka spruce, and Lut spruce, that is the cross between them, because all of those are species that may be attacked. We did not get heavily into the dynamics of the forest in the sense of, well, what percentage of spruce is it? How susceptible is it in other ways? Is it a forest that is, from a forestry perspective, likely to be at higher risk? And I'll explain a little bit more about the limitations of the model in a moment. We did not try to predict outbreaks in terms of, oh, there's going to be one in the year 2083, nor did we try to predict the risk per se, because that, as already alluded to, is dependent on the health and age and status and species mix of the forest, and that was outside of scope for us. So instead, we kind of turned the model inside out. We said, okay, we're not going to project the risk that spruce bark beetles will attack or kill a forest. Instead, we'll talk about the pre-existing protection based on climate that has been there in the past based on historical climate, and look at whether that protection is disappearing given the future of climate modeling for that area. So the results do not tell you whether there'll be an outbreak. They just tell you whether, based on climate variables, outbreaks might become much more possible or much more likely. And we were using, and when I'm talking about climate futures, we were using Earth system models, global circulation models from CMIP 5, and looking at more than one RCP to kind of look at a range of futures. So this is multi-decadal modeling based on downscaled climate models, and linking those to all the modeling that I've talked about relating to the beetles' life cycles. And then one of the online tools that I mentioned that SNAP hosts is this tool called the Northern Climate Report. It's public facing. It's intended to be accessible to a broad range of users, general public, but scientists as well. It allows you to download data sets in CSV format, but you can also look at the data on the screen. You can select by location. I welcome everyone to go take a look at this tool. It spits out real language sentences, summaries about temperature, precipitation, a lot of different climate variables. We housed the outputs from the model in this tool, so that it was part of kind of a broad scope look at, for the region that you're looking at, what is the climate future. And within the tool, this is the kind of data that pops out. So within the Northern Climate Reports, you can look at moderate emission, 4.5, high emission, 8.5. You can look at multiple models, and you can look at multiple outputs. So that's just a sneak peek at what else exists in the Northern Climate Reports. Okay, so moving quickly here, and you can always go read the paper if this is too fast. But we're trying to incorporate summer climate pathway. Can the beetles be univoltine? Survival through autumn cooling, survival through winter cold, putting it all together into one model. This is the ugly math. And this is again pulled from the literature, where all of these things had been done as separate controlled studies. So this is the model that we ended up with. It was a tiered staged model of percentage of beetles that might be able to be univoltine. None, 0 to 25%, 25 to 100%, as a linear interpolation. Then the fall survival, again drawn from the literature. If So the beetles need to replace the water in their body with glycol. They have a certain speed at which they're able to do that, triggered by the first day colder than minus 12 Celsius. Once they feel that cold, they start this transition. But if the transition occurs too quickly, they suffer. So again, we created a sort of regression across that time period to model survival. If the cooling is too quickly, you get a lot of loss of beetles. And then winter survival, again, from the literature, someone with a lot of patience had studied survival, not just based on cold, but under the bark layer, with and without protective snow layer around the roots, insulating. So this is great data from which we again set up a winter survival model. Had to put it all together into one rather large, ugly mathematical equation, and then had to calibrate it against survival values from the past. And I'm going through this really fast, but this was key, all the data that had been collected over the many years for when beetle outbreaks had taken place around the state. I was looking at when the outbreak had spiked and when it had dampened down again, and trying to calibrate the model based on what had the actual, not model, but actual weather conditions for those precise years across multiple locations, to try and figure out exactly how much outbreak is caused by those conditions. So jumping to the results, we ended up with statewide maps for Alaska where, because of the level of precision of the model, obviously with that many variables tossed into the mix, it's not going to be able to predict specific outbreaks. So we decided on 3 levels of modeled protection: high protection, moderate protection, and moving ahead of map, low protection. So what this effectively means is that in areas of low protection, climate is really doing absolutely nothing to kill off the beetles. The beetles are able to be univoltine, develop in 1 year. The fall is not killing them off. The winter is not killing them off. So given conditions in the forest that are favorable, you would be able to have an outbreak. Moderate protection, there's some degree of climate protection, but not as much as there could be. And then the green is high protection. And so moving back and forth here, this is historical, for historical time period, 1988 to 2017, assuming medium snow, which is kind of standard. So that was our default, although we also did it looking at low snow. What you see here is that during that time period, there was actually high protection from climate across much of the state, but across areas where there actually were beetle outbreaks during that time, it says moderate protection. And you might think, why is it only moderate, not low? We know there were huge outbreaks there, but the truth is that part of what triggers an outbreak is the forest condition, not just the possibility of the protection level. So again, we're looking at protection levels from climate only, not protection from any other factors affecting the forest. So we then created, these are obviously the same type of maps, little thumbnails, giving you some idea of the range of results. You'll see here, these are for different time periods, from the current time period to the middle of the century to the end of the century, for multiple different global models or system models, and for multiple scenarios, the RCP 4.5 and 8.5, showing different climate futures. So you'll note that these maps are, they range how desperate the future looks. The last 2 columns here are all the end of the century. Some of them show a lot of red, very little protection. Some of them still have a fair amount of green, but they all show a shift from more green to more of the yellow and red. So less overall climate protection. And of course, there's a forest mask on this map. So areas that are not forested just show up as white. So yeah, zooming in so you can see things a little bit better. This particular shows medium snow conditions for 2 different models. So the models show different results, but they, in all cases, show less climate protection into the future. This is a comparison for the 4.5 scenario for a couple different models. And again, I'm breezing through this. It's a little too much to show in this amount of time. This is the map on the left is one of the most dire maps in terms of the range of possible scenarios. But what you see across most of the maps is really complete loss of protection in the southern part of the state and variable predictions for loss of protection across the interior. There's not that much left green in all maps, really only the areas where the coldest winter temperatures might still prevail. So wrapping it up, even though there's a wide range of plausible futures, the climate protection from beetles is going to be declining. And what that might mean in terms of management, in terms of choices, is that expert knowledge of forest sites is going to become more and more important. Thinking about multiple stressors, thinking about what other protections can be afforded to those regions other than the climate protection that we've relied on in the past. So we're not saying that all of those forests will be decimated by beetles, but that we can no longer necessarily rely on cold winters or very short summers or rapidly cooling falls as enough protection. And that's playing out in real time. Beetles are moving north, and this really cold winter we had in Fairbanks, both of my kids who are adults now were like, well, that'll be really good for the beetles. So someone's been paying attention to my research. So like, it's great. It was a cold winter. It'll keep the beetles down. Anyway, I welcome everyone to go check this out at the URLs here. The code base, if you're curious about what exactly happened with all that code, all those numbers, it's publicly shared on GitHub. You can take a look at it. And again, I am not the code writer, so tremendous thanks to everyone I get to work with on the SNAP team. And huge thanks also again to the Alaska Climate Adaptation Science Center, particularly Jeremy Littell, who is one of the leaders on this project. So he was the one who pulled in a lot of that global climate modeling work. And this is, again, just some little thumbnails of what it looks like within the Northern Climate Reports tool, where you get zoomed in maps with a summary for whatever region you are. So within the tool, you get this, you choose Fairbanks, for example, you get a generated summary of a lot of different climate change variables. And if you scroll down, you can look at zoomed in beetle maps. And you can look at the same information in tables. You can download it as CSVs. And I should stop talking there and allow us to any quick questions before I let Ken take the floor.
Thanks, Nancy. That was great. Do we have a quick question or two from the audience? Go ahead and unmute yourself, or if you want to drop it in the chat, I can read it out. Larry.
Well, yeah.
So that was a great presentation, Nancy. I'm just curious as far as really quickly. So for biologic or other active methods of slowing beetle reproduction, is there any way to increase woodpecker populations? Could that be a potential response?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I ended up reading so many articles and learning so much about this during the process, which is always a great thing about my job. Like, so what I learned from a lot of woodpecker studies is that the woodpeckers will increase in population in response to outbreaks, but because beetles can reproduce much faster than woodpeckers can, so there's a race, and the beetles each female beetle can have 20 to 30 offspring per year. Whereas a woodpecker clearly can't have quite that many per clutch. So yeah, biologically speaking, the woodpecker populations do rapidly increase when there are a lot of beetles, but they can't keep up, and it's not enough to actually quell an outbreak. It might slow it a bit, but it can't stop the outbreak for that reason. You have some really happy woodpeckers, but it still doesn't stop the outbreak. Sorry, Wilbert had a question.
Wilbert. Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, a quick question. And maybe you mentioned it, Nancy. A very nice presentation. Thank you. So you showed a large diversity in the projections by the different models. Do you know which variable is the most important in generating the diversity? Is it temperature, snow?
It would be temperature. It would be temperature. So yeah, because um, the model for, in this case doesn't take into account precipitation at all, even though obviously that would be a stressor on the forest. So, if there's a drought, the forest would be more stressed. But the model itself is essentially a temperature model, but it's temperature from different seasons using, the very particular speed of cooling in the fall, coldest temperature in the winter, and then accumulated summer heat for a very particular window of time. It's like so many days after the first flight, and so it's complicated, but it's essentially a temperature model. And that the difference in temperature projections gets kind of magnified. So if one model, if one Earth system model is like 1 degree warmer on average, it's going to make a tremendous difference in what the outputs look like, because something like accumulated heat, would be different, even with a very small difference. So yeah, it's really warmer model versus cooler model, which is also why you see a big difference between the RCP 4.5 versus 8.5, because 8.5 just shows more warming. So it's tricky. The models that we selected, and this was very much Jeremy Littell's work, like helping to select models that were realistic and plausible, but also kind of bookending the situation. They're intentionally divergent. So there would be other models that would fall somewhere in between. But yeah, he was trying to help us to choose which models would kind of bracket the possibilities, which can be frustrating for managers, because like, well, is it the really dire one or the less one? But it does show that even with perhaps the most optimistic projections, there's still significant loss of climate protection.
Great, thank you.
Great. Thanks, Nancy, so much. We'll go ahead and move on to Ken.
Thanks, Lauren. Thanks, Nancy. That was super interesting. I was just jotting down a few similarities between the disturbance that I'm studying and about to present on, which is beavers and the spruce bark beetle, and they're pretty wildly different, which is I think that's just kind of cool. Have a very different, footprint, but there are a few similarities. Let me share my screen here while I'm getting going.
They both like trees.
They both kill trees. They both like trees. They don't need trees, but well, I guess beavers don't need trees. Spruce bark beetles do. Was snow in your model? Did you mention some things about snow?
Oh, yes. And I didn't really have time to show it. We ran the whole thing with normal snow and with low snow. Low snow is actually good for getting rid of beetles because the snow acts as an insulator. And so the cold winter temperatures don't kill beetles as much if there's a lot of insulating snow, is the story there. So you can see both full sets of maps with and without snow in our final results.
And is
But
that
yeah.
like snow on a tree?
It's snow, so it's really any significant amount of snow on the ground will protect. The beetles get under the bark of the tree, but they get low on the tree or on downed trees. So long as you have a few inches, like a genuine snowpack, like maybe at least 6 inches of snow, it's going to be protective because the beetles will get down low. And if you have a normal like Fairbanks snowpack, it's always going to insulate them, which is why we put more emphasis on the results I was showing you were all with snow. So you can look at more optimistic results without snow, though, because then the cold gets to them more
Right,
effectively.
right. Well, so there's a few more similarities. So we have these warming driven disturbances, right? That's what we're about to learn about beavers. They both kill trees. They both have these super dramatic predictions, right? I mean, some of the predictions you showed were like, wow, that's huge swaths of the forest. Um, and then they both benefit from deep snow. And for beavers, it has to do with ice thickness, right? Deep snow prevents thick ice, which means they can survive the winter. Anyway, my first slide likes to advance by itself. My name is Ken Tate. Thanks to Lauren and Hannah and Hazel for hosting this and for having me. This is from the Wulik River on the southern slopes of the Brooks Range. These are some new beaver dams here. This would have been chum spawning habitat. This is the northern limit of spawning salmon, which is about in the Brooks Range. And so it's just like beavers, they're targeting this groundwater resource. These are brand new beaver dams here. And this also has this river ends in Kivalina, and this has a world record Dolly Varden char. It's the world's biggest Dolly Varden char fish run. So super important for a number of reasons. And um, anyway, moving on. You guys know most of this situation, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. We've got these disturbances. The spruce bark beetle isn't in here because it's a tundra version of this figure, but you can see some thaw slumps, tundra fires, retreating glaciers, thawing permafrost, expansion of shrubby vegetation. We see some new herbivores like moose and then beavers down in the lower right corner. So just sort of a spectrum of different changes that are occurring in the Arctic. What's different between beavers and moose, there's a lot of things, but one of the big ones is that, moose move into a new area in response to increased shrubby habitat, longer summers, shorter winters. Beavers are doing the same thing, but they're imparting all these huge changes on the ecosystem as they move into these areas and re-engineer lowland landscapes. So permafrost hydrology, carbon cycling as these ponds are built that thaws permafrost adjacent to these new ponds that affects water quality. Fish, of course, in complex ways, some positive probably, but certainly some negative ways by preventing fish from accessing spawning grounds and habitat. Biodiversity, that also is complicated. We anticipate an increase in biodiversity as beavers create these warm water oases and wintertime refugia, but that's still at the hypothesis stage, and we're working on studies related to that. Boat access, of course, uh, you know, the rivers and waterways of Alaska and northern North America are the road system for these remote communities, and so you've just thrown up thousands of roadblocks along these road systems, and so that has an effect as well. And riparian vegetation, as you can imagine, it's not just the pond, but really the entirety of these lowland areas, these floodplains, when they get dammed, as they sort of transform into wetlands, is heavily affected. And so this is part of a 5-year AON project through NSF that's was going to end this year, and it's extended for one more year. And so it's really to integrate Pan-Arctic coordination of research, indigenous knowledge, and management. Most of what I'm going to talk about today is going to be the research side of that. We had a meeting in Fairbanks in 2024, and we have a meeting every year or two in person, and it's a really fun time. Bring all these different interests and expertise together. Here's Lance Kramer from Kotzebue showing everyone how to skin a beaver out Chena Hot Springs Road. So really, really interesting time. Here's some pictures just to give you an idea what it's like. This is a picture from above. You can see the Beaver Lodge. Here's the Beaver Dam. This is on the Seward Peninsula. This is about, I don't know, 4 years ago. That dam doubled in length. It grew to about 160 meters long. And then it blew out over here. It was rebuilt down low. And one thing you will learn when you study beavers is that they create a very dynamic landscape that really is pretty unfamiliar to me as someone who's been working in the tundra for a long time. The pace and magnitude of change is just not something that we were that familiar with. And it also makes it pretty interesting. Here's a picture from central Alaska. Actually, this beaver dam's been around for a while. This is from the Denali Highway, but still a tundra environment. This is what it looks like in winter. You go out there in winter and you just cannot believe that these beavers are surviving out there. So here's a little beaver lodge right here. Sometimes it's just totally white. You just would have no idea that there's anything there. Here's a beaver lodge. There's a dam down here. We come up to this pond and you'll drill through, 1.4, 1.8 meters of ice. Sometimes there's water down at the bottom in a few little pockets. Their shrub cache that they're feeding on throughout the winter is pretty much entombed in ice at that point. So it's just amazing that they are surviving out there. And one can really easily understand how, if you have more groundwater because your permafrost is starting to thaw, or you have thinner ice because you have shorter winters, how beavers are exploiting new habitat and moving into these tundra areas. So this is what it looks like from space or from above. This is color infrared photography in 1980. So everything that's red is actually green. That's a little stream, as wide as my office, if that. And then by 2019, the entire area has been transformed. So, our background was in landscape change in the Arctic. And so we studied, shrub expansion, a little bit of permafrost thaw and things like that. And when Ben Jones and I stumbled upon this change, it was just very striking to us how dramatic it was compared to most of the things we had been looking at. And if I'd been paying attention, the local cartoonist in Fairbanks, Jamie Smith, had this all figured out in 2001, it looks like. This is his cartoon. And indeed, this is the scene and the scenario that's been playing out across northern and western Alaska for the last 30 years, continuing today. Another quick view of what this looks like. This is west of Nome, a little ways in western Alaska on the Seward Peninsula. 2003, there's no beaver ponds. And then by 2016, the beavers, when they find that habitat, if it's good habitat, they procreate, they, move upstream and downstream and really transform these areas. This is some drone imagery from one of our sites. So we monitor a number of sites out on the Seward Peninsula. You can see a beaver pond over here. This is 2021. 2022 looks about the same. And then 2023, you start to see this pond form here. And I actually had put a control site. I was monitoring stream temperature right here. So just by pure luck, we happened to catch this pond as it formed. And so every year we come back to these places, and it's not just this new pond right here. The entire lowland area has transformed. And let me tell you, if you try to walk up and down there and make a measurement, you will quickly discover that it's really hard to get around. And 2025, and I had asked Ben, and there's actually another pond forming upstream of this one as well. So it just I'm trying to give you an idea of the scale and how dynamic these areas are. It's sometimes ponds forming, sometimes it's ponds draining, right? So that sort of static tundra stream that we might be used to from a familiar field location that you've been going to, it's kind of goes out the window once beavers get involved. Some big science questions that we're after. What is the scale of beaver engineering in the Arctic, and how is that changing in Alaska? It's a big scale. We've mapped over 10,000 ponds just in the tundra regions. I will talk a little bit about that in a minute. What is the nature of these impacts? That, of course, has all these different aspects to it. It could be carbon cycling, could be thawing permafrost, biodiversity, fish, those things I mentioned earlier. I don't really have time to get into a lot of those, but I'd be happy to discuss them. But then the big one that we're really coming to, I think, recently is how do these fit in the context of these other changes? So you've got these incremental shrub expansion. You've got other disturbances like spruce bark beetle, like wildfire, thaw slumps. Is it important? Does it matter in the context of all those other changes? And I'm thinking, yeah, it probably does matter, as you'll see in a minute. But nonetheless, quantitatively showing that the amount that beavers impart or change the landscape, matters in a larger context. That's a difficult question. I mentioned the indigenous knowledge that we do quite a bit on that side of this project. I'm not focused a lot on it here. And this is a bit of an acknowledgement slide, but also just alludes to all the different types of studies that we're doing related to beaver colonization of the tundra. You can see Paige Kehoe is a student at UAF. She's studying carbon cycling. Rodrigo Rangel is a Brazilian guy at the University of Toronto. He's doing ground penetrating radar, looking at underneath these ponds. Mike Larante's at Colgate. He's actually working on the methane stuff with Katie. Will Samuel is the fish biologist. We're still trying to get work funded on that, but Sebastian Zavoyko over here is a student studying biodiversity. He's actually looking at avian diversity, aquatic eDNA, and riparian plant diversity. Tom Glass is on the call today. He's done some great modeling as well as groundwater ecology and permafrost. Ben Jones has been my co-pilot on a lot of this work, and then Emily Graham studying permafrost. So that's a little bit of the Beaver team. How am I doing on time?
You have about 10 minutes or so
Wow, I'm
left.
talking fast. Okay. Well, I'm not going to take 10 minutes, but I'll take a few more minutes. Just to give you an idea what the expansion of beavers looks like, here's Kotzebue in Northwest Alaska. Here's 2002, you have two dams. By 2019, there's 98 dams. So this is happening incredibly rapidly. Of course, all the local people out there are aware of what's going on. All these streams are suddenly miniature wetlands with a lot of dams, and it's just really transformed the lowland landscape. Here's another view of the northern Baldwin Peninsula, again with Kotzebue right here. 2010, you had 94 dams. By 2019, over 400. So in looking at the numbers, if I say there's a doubling of beaver ponds in Western Alaska, it sort of masks the fact that what's actually happening is beavers are just transforming one stream at a time as they get to it. And really, the question is, if you live in the Arctic, is when are the beavers going to get to your area? So here's a map of beaver ponds in northern Alaska. Like I say, over 12,000 beaver ponds here. There's been a doubling from 2003 to 2017. What you can see is that they have chosen the warmer parts of northern Alaska to colonize, and I don't think that's an accident. The Brooks Range is a bit of an impediment, of an obstacle, but not really. I mean, there's rivers that lead up to divides that have a bunch of little lakes. But the issue is if they swim down the northern side into the Colville Basin or, north of the Continental Divide there, that's what that or Brooks Range Divide, I should call it. That's what that dotted line is. They still have to find habitat, suitable habitat. And right now, that habitat seems to be just right on the edge. So if we look at the historic and then future scenarios, this is the 6.0 on the left, and this is the 8.5 on the right. In both the 6.0 and the 8.5, you're seeing quite a bit of habitat suitability that is not there now and wasn't there historically. So we are anticipating that these beavers that are at the Brooks Range Divide right now, we are anticipating that they will colonize the North Slope at any moment. Right now, there are zero beaver ponds north of the Brooks Range Divide. There were a few on the Congacut River way out in the east, but those, lasted for several years and then disappeared. So according to the modeling that we've done, it looks like the future of the North Slope is going to be very wet and very beavery and very lush in terms of vegetation. And I'll show a couple videos just for fun to give you an idea, what this looks like. These used to be, like I say, little streams, the width of my office or maybe even my desk. And this is what they become. And this is just one example of many flying around the Seward Peninsula. So you can see these are all dams, right? It's just dams all the way up. Some lodges. And you can hear me talking the helicopter. And that's what it used to look like, right? So we're really transforming these lowland areas from these linear streams to sort of tiered wetlands. Another question that I get a lot that we don't necessarily have a great answer to is about predators. And this one's more just for fun, but um, you know, do bears or wolves, do these predators, are they responding to beavers as a new food source? And our sense has always been yes. We see a lot of tracks around these ponds and things like that. But I'm always a little hesitant to answer those questions when we don't have any evidence. And so I want to show a video, just a 10-second clip that we got from a game cam a few years ago. It's kind of a fun one. All right, so I'm going to play it again. So you got one, there's a bear in front of the camera that's messing with the camera, right? We got that. But what else is going on? I'll pause it this time. Okay, so what's going on there? So there's another bear standing on the lodge who is, scoping out this beaver that's nervously swimming back and forth. So anyway, we can say with a little bit more confidence, and we see lynx. I don't think we've caught wolves yet at our cameras, but I've seen wolf tracks. We see a lot of different predators showing up to these ponds, and other, moose love beaver ponds, birds love beaver ponds. So there's really a host of creatures that are, taking advantage of these oases. All right, so I put in a few questions here, and I think these were mostly for process-based modelers, like Hannah, like Eugenio Iskirkin at UAF. And my understanding of this part of the modeling world is pretty limited. So I'm relying on you to help me out with some of these questions. One is this question of does it matter is really, and I get this question from the press all the time. It's like, okay, beavers increase methane emissions along the stream. Does it matter? Does it matter in the grand scheme of things? And that's a tough question to answer, partly because we don't quite have the results to support it, but also because we are unable to include them in a modeling framework that where we could sort of twist the knobs and test some of these things. So we have maps that show, you know, current beaver habitat and where they're going to be in the future. I think we can even place beaver ponds in these future maps. And I think we could even blink them on and off, which is what we actually see happening. It's not like wildfire where it happens and there's this recovery period. It's more like once beavers show up, there's the wetland forms, and then it's kind of pinching in and out in various places as they move around. And so, but that idea of including, ecosystem structure and function in that model still seems really complicated to me, particularly because these ponds are, it's not like just putting a lake on the landscape, it's putting a lake on a stream, it's putting a pond on a stream. So it's pretty complicated, but I'd be curious to get people's opinions on how feasible that kind of modeling might be. I think someone mentioned that there were people who could place ponds on the landscape, and I know Elchin Shavarov, who's on the call here, wrote a paper with us, sort of looking at temperature modeling and sort of trying to place ponds on the landscape and then see how the surrounding area changes. That might be a way to start. But anyway, those are just a few sort of food for thought questions that I came up with, and I think that's about all I have. So I'd be curious to hear what suggestions people have. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Ken. Um, Amazing talk. It was great to see all the visuals of the work you're doing. I think we'll open up the floor for any questions for Ken for just one or two, and then we'll move into more general discussion. I think Ken did a really nice job of sort of framing some interesting questions for the group. So I have a question for you, Ken. So I guess one of the things that you were talking about when you sort of put up your questions of like what, you know, might be needed for modelers is I think of like, okay, you're thinking about like you have a map, you have a sense of like where beavers are and where beavers might be. So do you think of this like beaver like ponding as like a stochastic process you could put into like a larger Earth system model? Or do you think of it as like a very directed process, essentially, a stochastic process related to like where streams and rivers might be?
Hmm, that's a tough question. Do I think of it as a directed process or a stochastic? Well, what do you mean by stochastic? Like, I don't exactly know where they're going to be.
Yeah, like you don't exactly know where they're going to be or when they're
Sure.
going to form, but you have like a sense of sort of their timing, maybe. Um, or do you have like a really strong sense of like the timing, like the time in which you think, like where and when they should be?
I think we have a pretty good sense, on a regional scale or even a somewhere between regional and local scale,
Hmm.
where they're going to be and when they're going to show up. Now, exactly where they are along the floodplain, that might be where the stochasticity and where
Hmm.
it's blinking on and where, when I say blinking on and off, I mean forming, being
Yeah.
constructed, and draining, right? And so the blinking on and off is probably more of the stochasticity.
Mhm.
But and again, this might be just my ignorance in the modeling world, but how do we put a wetland on the landscape? How do you model a new wetland on the landscape? That's the
Mhm.
first question. Forget the stream. Just like can you place a wetland on the landscape with a bunch of attributes? And then
Mhm.
the second part of that is, could we do it along a stream?
Yeah.
Because I understand a lot of these models don't, well, you probably know more than I do, so I should be quiet.
I think it depends on the model. It depends on how the infrastructure is constructed, on whether you can change essentially the land type. But yeah. But Howard, do you have a question?
Yeah, hey, hey, Ken, thanks so much for the talk. That was really great. Yeah, comment on this sort of placing a wetland thing. I'm not doing any of that modeling necessarily myself, but I think well, the situation, the scenarios are slightly different, but this sort of the transition from terrestrial to aquatic systems, you could probably leverage work. But from folks who are looking at ice wedge polygon degradation and pond and trough formation, because again, they're different, they're different scenarios, but effectively, in a sense, you're doing some of the same things, right? You're taking a terrestrial landscape and you're putting water on it, so you're putting a pond where there wasn't one before. And I think there are some, I think there are some folks who are trying to tackle that, from a modeling perspective. The uh, DVM-TEM folks, that's Eugenie's group, I think. But I think people are starting. I think it's not. I think it's not completely new. I think people are starting to think about this. They're starting to think about modeling new wetlands or new ponds and things, where they didn't exist before. So anyway, yeah, maybe the groups could leverage, information from one another. Anyway,
I,
that was my comment.
I
I do
appreciate
have a
that.
question though. Um, do any of these areas have any of these areas um, been occupied? Are they included in any of the recent historic ranges of beavers, like past few centuries? Or are these like brand new places, brand new, like, in the past few centuries where we haven't seen beavers before?
It's such an important question, and I'm glad you asked it. The short answer is we don't have any evidence of historical or prehistorical occupation in most, like beavers arrived in Shishmaref. Neither the people in Shishmaref nor, but the problem is once you go back to that evidence, you're talking about archaeological evidence.
Yeah, right.
And
Yeah.
so you're really talking, are there beaver bones and middens? And the answer is generally no, but I don't want to say absolutely because I don't know if it's the absence of evidence or evidence of absence, you know,
Yeah.
that sort of thing. But in general, when you talk to the people in those regions, they're not like, oh yeah, beavers are returning. They're more like Inupiaq are not beaver people, is something that I'll
Right.
that I'll hear, right? So that having been said, because really this gets to the question of are they going to continue to expand, right? If they're just reoccupying their former range, then we don't necessarily, they'll occupy that former range and then they'll stop. But what our modeling indicates is that they're responding. And Tom Glass, our postdoc on the project, is on this call, and he's done some really interesting work where he looks at uh, beaver dam. He can see whether or not a beaver dam is intact from space or if it's breached. And so by looking at years that beaver ponds are formed and years that beaver ponds breach, and looking at the environmental and climatic factors
Mm.
associated with those locations in those years, he has a really interesting paper that's in review right now that really shows how those climate factors are directly responsible or directly facilitating the expansion. But one more thing about that question, if you go, I'm in Fairbanks right now, you go to Goldstream Valley, 2 miles away, beavers returned to Goldstream in mid 20th century.
Ah, right.
Okay,
Yeah.
because they've been trapped out of the area. Beavers
Yeah.
return to Michigan, they return to California. So it's really only out at these limits in the tundra where we're seeing the strong influence of climate.
Hmm. Great. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Appreciate the question.
Yeah.
We have 1 more minute, so if anyone else has any one more follow-up question. Larry.
So really quickly, Ken, we have a cabin down in Chattanooga that we've had for 50 years. And about 20 years ago, there was beavers on all these thaw lakes. They were everywhere. And we had a huge flood event in late September and wiped out all these beaver dams, and just, the population just crashed, and they've never recovered. So, obviously the terrain is appropriate for beavers. So did they all just move up north, or what happened to them all? Why don't they come back?
That's a great question. I have seen a fair bit of active trapping in that area.
Hmm.
Um, but other than that, I'm not sure. Um, you know, Big floods, but you're saying they just never came back. I mean, I've always seen a decent number of beavers on the Chattanooga. When did they get wiped out?
About 20 years ago. I mean,
20 years.
there was just massive numbers of them down there, a
Huh.
long time ago. And then, there are
Huh.
still a few beavers, but they just haven't returned in the numbers that there were there. It used to be around every bend you'd see a beaver swimming down the river or something like that. It was amazing.
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, I'm due for a Chattanooga float, so maybe I'll go out there and uh, see for myself. I don't know.
Well, get
Appreciate
off and
that.
look at the ponds. Anyway,
Yeah,
thanks.
yeah.
That was a great presentation. Thanks.
Appreciate it, Larry.
Well, we're at time. So I just want to thank our speakers again. Thank you, Nancy. Thank you, Ken. It was great to hear about your guys' research. Very much appreciated. So thank you from IARPIC. And Hazel has posted the link to the meeting here and our YouTube channel. So if you guys are interested in listening again or passing it along to your colleagues, please feel free to do that. So thank you, Ken. Thank you, Nancy. It was great to hear from you guys. So thank you.
Thanks everyone for coming.
My pleasure.
Thank you. And there
Bye.
was one question in the chat, and I think that
Sorry.
person is still on. It's okay. I think I missed it as well. But Ken, I think it's for you if you have a minute to answer it.
Sure.
It's
Yeah.
what is the
What's the
local
local
opinion?
opinion?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's pretty negative. The local, they generally see, and I'm going to speak for them, of course, which I'm always hesitant to do, but the general opinion is that, beavers, they'll use the term invasive species. They come in kind of riding on the back of climate change and all these other changes, and then suddenly they're damming up all these streams. The concerns about beaver fever, giardia are present. So there's concerns about water quality. Those are sort of the two big things, fish and water quality. And absolutely you can see why that would be concerning. So I would say that's the local opinion. It's not uniform, but that's the general consensus, I would say.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks. Helped.
Appreciate it. Great question.
Thank you.
Thanks very
Bye.
much.